Alright, so by this point in time, your painting should be dry. If it is not dry, pause now. So it is dry. I know mine is dry because I can touch it and no paint is coming off on my hands. So we're going to apply the three elements that I just taught you guys of the circles and the highlights and the shadows. So first I'm going to be adding in our circle marks. Okay, so I have my pencil. I'm going to be marking hard so you can see it, but at home I would suggest marking lightly. Alright, so we had a couple technical difficulties, but I want to catch you up with where I got. So again, I'm adding circular shapes to mark where my clouds are going to go. Depth-wise, the closer something is to the bottom of your canvas, the closer it's going to be to you. So if things are closer to you, you get a lot more detail in them. So this element, this cloud guy that is closer to the ground, he has a lot more circular shapes in him than the one that is further away, because things that are closer to us have more detail. So this guy is going to be my closer cloud, and I've added a lot of circular shapes to him. This one, since it's further away from the bottom, is going to be my second cloud, and you'll see that he has less circular shapes coming to him. So the next element that we're going to be talking about is our sun source. So I'm going to add our sun source, or our light source, to the painting. So everything that happens with this painting, everything that is closest to this sun source is going to be a brighter color and a lighter color. So we're going to be thinking our titanium white. So if we are coming this way, everything that is reflecting this is going to be quite bright and quite white. So I've already split this one here. If I have it coming at this one, I'm going to think that. And I'm using a circular line because we're thinking about circles and spheres. If you use a straight line, then you're no longer having a three-dimensional shape. So the circular line keeps us remembering that it's all circular. So I'm going to be coming down from my sun here, thinking about this one. Coming down from my sun here on this huge shape, thinking here. So I'm dragging it down every time to make sure that I'm remembering exactly where my light source is. This is going to help a lot with making sure that it stays three-dimensional looking. So I have a lot of lines going on. That's okay. Every place that our sun is not hitting, on the other side of it is going to be where our shadows are. I'm not going to add those marks because there are going to be a lot of marks going on. But what I want you to be thinking about is that it's a sphere. So one side where the light hits is going to be quite bright, and the reverse side is going to be quite dark. Everything else in the middle is going to be our mid-tone. So this is where it starts getting really fun. I'm going to tell you guys what I'm going to do first, then we're going to mix up some paint, and we're going to start painting this guy. So the first thing we're going to be doing is adding our mid-tone everywhere. And then we're going to be adding in our light source and thinking about that, and we're going to be thinking about our shadows too, okay? So this is to get us in the mindset of remembering that we are making a three-dimensional shape. We have these spheres that are going to be three-dimensional. We have these spheres that are three-dimensional. It's going to be lightest facing the sun and darkest on the other side. So this area here is going to end up being in shadow. This one is going to be in front. So we're actually not going to see this mark at all. This area here is going to end up being in shadow. You do not need to add these shadow marks unless you think that it's really going to help you. The marks are going to be really dark, so you won't end up seeing it anyway. Let's mix some paint. Okay, so we are here and we are about to set up our palette. So I have everything I need here. I have my three paints, and I'm going to put down my rose gray first, which is the mid-tone. And I'm going to put down about a quarter's amount of rose gray onto my palette. I'm also going to add the Mars Violet, which is my darkest tone, about half the amount that I added of the rose gray. And I'm also going to add this titanium white. So guys, if you need more than what I'm using, that is totally fine. I really don't use that much paint because I use a lot of Gamsol, and I like my paint to go a really long way instead of kind of gloppy. So this is why you actually use gloves when you're mixing, because you already have stuff on them. So this is my Gamsol. you know, a healthy amount. It doesn't need to be doubled, and I'm going to add a little more oil this time. Maybe like doubled, maybe even tripled the amount of oil I used last time. And I'm going to mix this up until it's nice and not chunky. If you are using acrylic, I want you to be mixing this with your glazing material. It's really important. You're not going to want it quite as watery as this looks, and actually I don't want it this water either, so I'm going to add a little more paint. But you're definitely going to want your paint to be more fluid than what comes out of the tube if you're an acrylic person. It's really important that for this process that it stays wet for a long time, and you will see why. So adding that glazing fluid is definitely going to help you make clouds so it stays wet for longer. So mine's starting to get pretty good. I have less globs in here, so I'm just trying to get it as smooth as possible and make sure everything's really mixed in. So it's getting pretty darn good here. Beep, boop, beep, beep, beep. I think we're ready. All right, so we have our paint mixed. We are ready to start painting this guy. I'm starting with my number 10. I'm starting with it because it is larger than my other favorite one, and this is when things are going to be the least detailed, so I'm not worried about getting in those sort of technical shots. How I'm going to be moving my brush is actually the most important part. So instead of a lot of sweeping, I'm going to be doing a lot of dabbing. This makes the this rounded part of the brush, you're going to see a lot of that mark, and that helps us remember that these things are all circular. So circles and circles and circles, guys. All right, I'm starting. If you are starting with oil like I am, I would suggest making sure your brush isn't 100% dry. I like to use the Gamsol, so I have one that I dip into, and then I just wipe off the excess with a rag. If you're working with acrylic, just dip your brush into some water so you're not working 100% dry. It just gets really scratchy really quick, so that I really like. So I'm just going to dip into my paint here. I don't have a lot on there. And I'm actually going to be working with this one in the back first, because then when I move to the one in front, those marks will be layered on top of. So we're already thinking about how we're going to be building this depth. All right, we're going to do it. So this is our mid-tone. So you're going to be thinking about the middle chunk of your painting. You can definitely extend your mid-tone onto the bottom, but we want to be careful of this white highlight area that we've already marked out, okay? So I'm going to start working here. And I can see my line right here of where I said that my highlight is going to be on this back shape. So I'm going to work right up to the line here. So you can see I'm doing little dabs. You can see this rounded brush shape right there. And I'm just going to start filling out the shape. This is definitely a time if you want to use gobs of paint. This is a gobs of paint time, because we're just trying to fill the surface here. We got some big clouds going on. So you can see I'm going all the way to the bottom of my shape. I think that is totally fine right here. And I'm using this paint that I pre-mixed. And I can see that it's kind of thin here. I actually might pull some straight from the tube. Okay, so I'm just going to go grab my tube really quick. So I don't do this all the time, but I definitely do it some of the time, and you can definitely do this with acrylic. Since I already have medium mixed in here, I'm not worried about adding a little bit straight from the tube. So I'm actually just going to dip my brush right onto there and start dabbing it on. So this kind of leaves a bunch of open room on this big shape for where the highlight was, but since we have all these other globs, I'm going to start painting in those midtones too. So here I am starting to flatten out the bottom, and I'm not doing that dabbing stroke anymore. I'm just trying to kind of fill it out. And I just added some paint directly from my tube here. I already have a bunch of medium, the oil, and the Gamsol in my brush, so I feel okay adding it directly from the tube. And so I'm still sticking with adding this mid-tone, this rose gray, to the middle and bottom of these spherical shapes that I have going on here. And every single brush stroke I'm making is starting from the top, so where the highlight will hit, and it's being dragged downwards. So it's a downward motion every time. Here I'm smoothing out the bottom again. I like a flat bottom on my cumulus clouds. That tends to make a difference for me. And just, I really want to emphasize that dabbing motion. That really is, that's the stuff. So I just used a rag, and that's a little bit of foreshadowing, so I'll get into that a little bit later, but I'm showing you guys here rinsing out my brush because it is super, super important that you have a clean brush for this next part. So I'm trying to show you here, I'm starting to add in this Mars Violet, and that is a shadow. So the shadows are going to be the part that is not seen by our light source. So we're really going to be thinking about what is going to be darker. I know that this cloud right here that I'm working on is going to be behind my cloud that's in front. So I'm really trying to add a shadow to that edge. So it looks like the first one is casting a little bit of a shadow. Now I'm adding it to the bottom of that spherical shape. So we're thinking about three-dimensional shapes, adding some shadow to the bottom of it. And the only time I'm not doing dabs on this part, you'll see, is kind of sweeping, and it is in that same sort of circular, everything is still really circular. So unless I'm drawing the straight, painting straight for the bottom, everything is really rounded. Even right now, I'm using my brush or my rag, and it is using circular motion. So this rag has a teeny tiny bit of Gamsol on it. If you're working with acrylic, water is going to be great on your rag. And I'm wrapping it around my finger, and I'm just sort of blending out the two colors that are down here. And it really makes it smooth. That's why I prefer the rag. And the background is leaking through a little bit, which I think is really interesting. So you can keep moving your rag around so you get a clean spot, but really just use this for moving the paint and for blending, and making sure you're using really tight circular motions. So I'm just using it, except for right here, but for the most part I'm just using it to kind of allude to where my highlights are going to be. So I'm dragging where the paint is to where the paint is not, and then I just went over that bottom line. Working on the front cloud now, so I'm just coming in and adding the shadows, and I keep reminding myself where the light source is coming from. So if you see my paintbrush sort of move off and on the page, I am touching the sun in the corner and dragging my hand straight down to make sure that my light source stays consistent. Boop, just like that. So I'm back to my rag, and I'm doing that same thing. So I'm making sure I have a really tiny tip, and see, circle motion, circle, 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 circle. So it is dragging where the paint is to where the paint isn't, and just a little bit of small circular motions for the blending. So right here you can see circle, 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 and it's blending it and pushing it out, and then it's done. Really be careful. If you overdo this, then you lose all the shadows that you've just worked so hard for. You can see I'm just doing a quick little zoop, and then I'm moving on. Alright guys, so this part, if you are working with acrylic, go ahead and extra dip your rag in some water. Hopefully your paint is still quite wet. This I'm dipping into the Gamsol. And because my oil paint is still really wet, dipping it into the Gamsol is just letting me essentially wipe off what I've just painted. So I'm pulling from where the highlight should be on all of these clouds. So the top of that sphere, or the area of the sphere that the sun would be touching. So when I'm dipping it, I'm not putting that dipped part, that extra wet part, I'm not touching it to any other part of my cloud other than where I want the highlight to be. And you can see it really pulls it off. So we're still in a very loose time. It's really not detailed. And if your painting's wet, you can play with this rag thing for a really long time. So, you know, enjoy yourself. If you're hating it, you can see here that especially if you're working with oil, if you get your whole rag wet with Gamsol, you can wipe off all your clouds and just start over. So it's actually a pretty safe time. We're not adding any detail right now. We're just sort of letting ourselves know where we're going to put everything. So I'm using my rag, especially the dirtier spots are great for just making sure things are looking blended. So I'm hating this blob here. So I'm going to add in some more spheres so you can tell I have my Gamsol that I'm ready to dip. And I'm actually just removing some paint here so I don't have a huge glob, paint glob, cloud glob, excuse me. So I'm really keeping the areas of the clouds that are closest to you, the viewer, lighter than the other areas. If you make a mistake, you can use the same idea. So you can see I just got a clean part of my rag. I dipped it in the Gamsol and I'm actually just wiping it right off. So this is why we wait for our background to be 100% dry so we can clean ourselves up. And I'm just using that same clean part of my rag to pull out the highlights. And it looks really simple right now, guys. It takes a couple layers for anything real to happen. I'm finally using my little favorite brush now. This is that number 12 round something. I'll put a note of it. And I'm using that same motion, that drag from the top to the bottom, and they're little dabs. So it's almost, they're spherical. I would say each mark you make is an oval that goes from the top of your light source to the bottom. So each is a little bit of a drag and a little bit of a dab. And I'm using that titanium white on a wet painting, and I'm only bringing the white where the highlight should be. So every time before I add it, I'm going to my light source and checking in with it, and then adding my highlight to make sure that my highlight's going to be in just the right spot. And as you can tell here, it's just a little ridge at this point. I'm not worrying about blending. I'm just worried about getting the color onto the canvas right now. So we already have our background color. We already have our shadow color. We have our mid-tone. And now I'm worried about getting on our highlight color. It's that same motion, just dabbing. Everything is a dab when you're thinking about the texture of your clouds. I'm going to add in another sphere here. You can see I just added the highlight of it right there. And now I'm using that Deerfoot blending brush that I told you guys about. If you wanted it, it could be like a little bonus. There is no paint on it. There is just a little bit of Gamsol. And I'm just using it to blend in where the highlight is with the rest of the wet paint. So I'm going right on that border of the two colors. You can see me kind of dragging and pulling that highlight color down into the other wet paint. This is when it starts looking a little more real. So I have two different brushes. You'll see with my little one, I have only white on there. with my big one, I'm only gonna have dark. So it's really important that to keep all of your values as they should be, you do need at least 2 brushes for this. For your blending, if you opted to not get a Deerfoot one, that is totally fine, but you do have to do it with a clean brush. So if you don't have a third brush, just keep one that you can clean often. So as you can see, I'm just working to add in some shadows also. And back to highlighting. You can really see here the motion that I'm going in. So it is top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. Checking it with my light source, adding that top to bottom still. So everywhere where I kind of wiped away the paint with the Gamsol is where I'm filling in now with our highlight color. I'm going to slow it down so you can really see that motion. So it is top to bottom, and then it almost looks like I'm doing a zigzag because I'm going quite fast, but it is a little drag with that top to bottom. And right here, you don't always have to grab fresh paint. You can actually use a dirty brush for your blending. So I'm going back to my Deerfoot, and you can really see how that blending works. So it's a dry brush, or it doesn't have any paint on it. It does have a little Gamsol. And I'm just painting right where that border is and smearing that highlight color down. Let's zoom it out here. We're just gonna zoom it out. So here you can see that it's really starting to look like clouds, guys. So right now I'm just going through with that Deerfoot blender and dragging that highlight so it's not a really hard line that you can see there on the left of my hand. And I am just blending it down. So I'm not adding any paint. I am literally just working with the paint that is already on our canvas, and I'm just blending it down. Okay guys, so at this point in time, I really want to stop working on it because I don't want to overwork it. So I'm actually going to let it rest and let it dry and come back to it when it's dry. So if you're working with acrylic, a couple hours. If you're working with oil, maybe a couple days. I just wanted to talk to you guys about what we've done so far. So remember, we were talking a lot about the spheres. So the spheres ended up translating into really large shapes and really small shapes. So remember, we had a huge sphere here, we had a huge sphere here, and then all of these little lumpy cloud shapes were all spheres. So what you only end up seeing actually is the highlight from our sun source. And then our shadow is going to be on the reverse side. So this one in particular, you can see where the shadow is coming up on this sphere, but also because this sphere is here, this area is in shadow too. If you're imagining a big ball, then right here would be in shadow. We also did a lot of work on flattening out the bottom, and we're going to kind of tighten that up again with our last session. And I also wanted to say, with that dabbing motion, that is keeping with the circular idea. So every dab that we did is actually its own little mini circle. So I'm going to let this guy rest, and I hope you let yours rest too. and I'm going to come back to it in a couple days and I'm really going to clean it up. So I'll see you in a couple days. Bye.